The Trump administration is preparing to withdraw up to 6,000 troops from Afghanistan following months of negotiations with the Taliban. That is according to the Washington Post. In exchange, the Taliban would agree to a ceasefire and would disavow al-Qaeda. This initial deal to end the nearly 18-year-old war could be finalized as soon as next month, ahead of the Afghan presidential elections. 14 U.S. service members have been killed in Afghanistan this year alone. The latest 2 soldiers killed on Monday. Joining me now is Admiral James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO and an NBC News Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst. Admiral, great to have you with us, sir. What are your thoughts on this potential withdrawal?
I'm of a mixed mind as follows. What we want to avoid here, Ayman, is a replay of Vietnam in the early 70s, where we got so politically hungry to leave that we ended up with the complete collapse of the regime and helicopters lifting off the embassy, hauling the last few diplomats away under fire. We're a long way from that scenario, but this current agreement is a practical U.S. concession withdrawing troops, and yet I don't really see the practical steps from the Taliban. So I think it's a flashing yellow light at this point. And just to keep it in perspective, when I commanded that mission as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, it's a NATO mission, I had 150,000 troops. Now it's down to 14,000 troops. We've already withdrawn 90% of the troops. So we had to just kind of take it slow here. We've got a great negotiator, Ambassador Zal Khalilzad. I know you know him. He's the right person to negotiate this. I have a lot of faith in him. Let's see the Taliban step up and deliver a ceasefire. That would be the big practical step next.
Yeah, I was going to say, and to that point, I mean, nothing in the Taliban behavior has changed over the 18 years. They've been attacking and killing American soldiers. They've been attacking the Afghan government. They've been killing civilians. They haven't changed their ideology. Why in the world would they suddenly be trustworthy at this point?
I would share that same set of concerns, to say the least, and that's why I think probably a residual force in the range of 10,000 troops. And by the way, we ought to point out that we've got 6,000 allied troops from NATO who are there alongside those U.S. troops. That's a very small commitment, frankly. I think that keeping that level there for the moment is the right course of action. But again, I'm willing to let the Taliban show us that they have changed. And I'll give you a practical example of where that approach has actually worked, and it's in the Western Hemisphere. It's in Colombia, where you'll recall the FARC guerrillas fought a 50-year insurgency. Eventually, that was settled with a peace agreement. The FARC now have some seats in the Congress of Colombia. That would be a good model. So what we want is a Colombia-style peace, not a Vietnam ending.
Let me play for you, sir, the president and these comments he made about ending the war in Afghanistan just last week. Listen to this.
If we wanted to fight a war in Afghanistan and win it, I could win that war in a week. I just don't want to kill 10 million people. Does that make sense to you? I don't want to kill 10 million people.
What does that sort of rhetoric do both to the negotiations between Ambassador Khalilzad and the Taliban as these talks are taking place, and more importantly, to even troop morale in the region?
Yeah, it's so impractical at every level, and the idea that we would go in there effectively and destroy the entire country to win the war is absurd. And it doesn't help the negotiations. Zal Khalilzad, whom I know very well, former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and to Iraq, extremely experienced. He's trying to nudge these two sides together. Dropping a rhetorical bomb like that does not help his cause.
Sir, let me switch gears for a moment and get your thoughts on the nuclear arms race that we're on the cusp of, if you see it that way, which is this morning the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, announcing that the U.S. was formally ending its nuclear arms control treaty. In a statement, though, he actually put the blame squarely on Russia, saying it is Russia that has been in violation and bears sole responsibility for the deal ending. So I go back to my original point. Are we, sir, on the cusp of a nuclear arms race again?
I think we are on the cusp of a tactical nuclear arms race. In other words, there are big strategic nuclear weapon systems that are intercontinental. This treaty is about a smaller subset of those, but certainly we are on the cusp of the U.S. producing a new class of nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon, in order to balance what we perceive Russia has done in violation of the treaty. Look, on this one, I think that it is the Russians who have effectively broken the treaty. They're in clear violation of it at every level. What we ought to be doing is working with our allies and partners in Europe to get Russia back to the negotiating table, and that's going to require probably at some point additional sanctions, and there's certainly other elements of Russian behavior that would allow us to put more pressure, including the way Putin is crushing protests in Russia this coming weekend. We'll see that again, I'm sure. So I think this is going to be about putting coalition and international pressure on Russia to rebuild some level of agreement. And, oh, by the way, Ayman, let's try and get China into this, who also has a strong inventory of this set of weapons. This one is a tough one going forward. It's going to require real international diplomacy if we don't avoid stumbling into another high-level Cold War with tactical nuclear weapons.
And so your final thoughts on North Korea. It reportedly launched a third missile test in just over a week. And according to South Korea, the president says, well, I should say that is according to South Korea about the missile launch. But the president here says he's actually not worried. Should he be, the fact that they have done this now so many times in such a short period of time?
Yeah, it's 3 times now in the last 4 weeks. And Ian Fleming in the James Bond novel said, when you see an attack, the first time is happenstance. The second time is perhaps coincidence. The third time is enemy action. I think this is Kim very deliberately saying, hey, I'm still here. I want to be part of the big international conversation. He feels like that old saying the gypsies have, the carnival moves on. He doesn't want that carnival moving on. He wants the attention. And last point, Ayman, I think China is nudging him toward these events because China wants to play that South Korea card as part of the larger trade negotiations that are unfolding and not going very well at the moment.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.